To discuss the change of heart on education and the government's economic statement, I was joined from Perth a short time ago by the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Matthias Cormann. Matthias Cormann, welcome to Capitol Hill. Do you now know the budget parameters that you will have to work your costings against?
We absolutely know nothing more about the budget parameters now than we did back in May. I mean, what we do know is that every day and every week the budget position continues to deteriorate under the government. We know that in May the budget papers weren't worth the paper they were written on because, of course, within a week or so of the budget being released, the Secretary of Treasury was telling us that it was based on overly optimistic assumptions on the terms of trade and, as such, overly optimistic assumptions on revenue.
There doesn't appear to be that much optimism about the terms of trade in this document. If you are in government and Treasury presents you with a set of revenue forecasts, what do you do? Do you lop a figure off and present a set of revenue forecasts that is not the recommendation of Treasury?
Well, let's just look at what happened over the last 11 weeks. It's just 11 weeks ago since the budget was released, and at the time the government was telling us there would be an $18 billion deficit in 2013-14. That's now going to be a deficit of more than $30 billion. We said at the time the government was overestimating revenue and underestimating expenditure, and that's exactly what has now become apparent. And we actually think that the government is still not telling us the truth. I mean, just to give you one example of that, we're now meant to believe that the budget would go back into surplus in 2016-17. Yet in that year, the government is basing its carbon tax revenue assumptions on an international carbon price assumption of $18.60, which nobody believes. So I mean, the Labor Party is still not telling people the truth. What we've seen today is a massive deterioration in the budget position again. The Labor Party has lost control of the budget. They've lost control of the economy. This is still the same bad old Labor Party. This is still the same bad old Kevin Rudd. They're trying to play catch-up with one more tax grab after the other, and they still can't balance the books.
If you believe revenue will actually be worse than the government is now forecasting, does that mean when you put your costings together, you have to, at the very least, accept the government's tax rises, its change to fringe benefits on salary-sacrificed cars, its increase in the tobacco excise, in order to get more revenue flowing into the government coffers?
Lyndal, we do what we've said for some time we would do, and that is release our full costings and our detailed fiscal statement in good time before the next election. I will not be putting to you today the coalition's pre-election costings or the coalition's pre-election fiscal statement. What we've seen today is an acknowledgement by Kevin Rudd and Chris Bowen that 11 weeks ago Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan were lying to the Australian people when they put out the budget.
But if you believe
they're still not telling the truth.
If you believe things will be worse, that revenue is actually lower than the government, will be lower than what the government is now estimating, if you believe that potentially that makes the deficit larger, won't you have to promise more cuts and less spending if you are to hit your own surplus targets?
What we promise to the Australian people is honesty and transparency and actually a reliable and credible pathway back to surplus. So, of course, should we be the government at the next election, we will be making sure that people have a clear understanding of what the true state of the budget is. The Labor Party has never so far in any of their budgets or budget updates been honest in terms of their predictions on where the actual state of the budget was at.
Can a coalition government get a budget back into surplus in its first term based on not only these figures but your expectation that they will actually be worse?
Well, I mean, this is what I'm saying. I mean, we've got to know what, I mean, in order to be able to answer that question responsibly, we do need to know what the true starting position is. The Labor Party is not telling us what the true starting position is. We said in May that the budget that the Treasurer Wayne Swan had put out at the time was dishonest, that it wasn't a true reflection of the facts, and now it's very obvious that that was true. We think that the government is still not telling us the truth. What we see is a massive deterioration in deficit, a massive deterioration in the government's debt position, more new taxes, and still the government is not able to balance the budget.
If you don't believe these figures, and you're not going to believe Treasury and Finance's pre-election fiscal outlook, does that mean you won't be making any promises, any predictions of what you would have in terms of surpluses or deficits unless you win? That would be the point in time at which you start making predictions?
Well, we will be providing a very clear, a very honest and a very direct explanation of our fiscal strategy and of our pre-election costings in good time before the election. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation now that the election is about to be called. So, Lyndal, you won't have to wait for much longer. We will be able to share that with you. But what we've seen today is a massive deterioration in the budget. I mean, what we've seen today is yet again a downgrading in growth forecasts. What we've seen today is yet again increases in the unemployment rate. So, I mean, in May, Labor was promising that this was going to be a budget for jobs and growth. And of course, what we see is increased unemployment and lower growth.
You don't believe the numbers coming out of the government or coming out of Treasury and Finance. Have you actually managed to find anyone else in the country who you think is better at forecasting the Treasury and Finance?
Well, I mean, you'll just have to wait and see when we release our pre-election costings. You will see that they will be much more credible than the figures that the Labor Party puts out on the table. I mean, every single budget over the last few years, the Labor Party has got it wrong. Every single budget, they've overestimated revenue dishonestly and aggressively, optimistically. Every single budget, they've underestimated expenditure. And I mean, don't believe this spin that somehow revenue is collapsing. Revenue is still increasing by about 5.6% this financial year. It increased by more than 6% last financial year, well above the rate of inflation. I mean, if people out there across the community were able to benefit from the sorts of revenue increases in percentage terms that the government has been able to benefit from, they'd be very, very comfortable with that. But this is a government that has got a spending problem, not a revenue problem.
If I could move on to the change in the Coalition's education policy, Tony Abbott has said that he has deep reservations about the government's proposed new funding model. Only yesterday, Christopher Pyne told this program that the government's model was a con, that it would do damage. Why are you now saying that you would keep it over the forward estimates?
Well, I mean, the government's model is a con, and we remain deeply concerned about the level of Commonwealth interference in the running of individual schools that is part of the government's so-called Gonski changes. But what we of course do understand, based on the feedback that we've been getting from important stakeholders across Australia, is that there is a need for certainty. So what we've said is we would maintain the same funding envelope as is put on the table by the current government for the initial 4 years, and then we'll work it from there.
The model the government has put out is a 6-year model. Will you fund it over the 6 years, or will you only fund it over the 4?
Well, the government has not funded it over the 6 years. I mean, you can't trust what the government...
Will you commit to it over the 6 years, over the full life of the model?
I mean, you've seen what the announcement was today. I mean, the announcement is that we'll stick to the same funding envelope over the next 4 years. And you've just got to remember, you can't trust Labor's commitments from one budget to the next. I mean, over the last few years, they've made promises in one budget only to scrap them in the next budget.
But the Coalition's position has changed from yesterday to today.
Well, I mean, we're still here before the election. We're still here before the election. We've made our announcement today, which is very clear. We'll stick to the same funding envelope over the next 4 years. Obviously, if we have some more to add to that between now and the election, we will be doing that. And Christopher Pyne, as the Shadow Minister for Education, will take the lead in terms of making those sorts of announcements between now and the election.
Matthias Cormann, thank you very much for your time.
Always good to be here.